So welcome everyone to the launch of the 2011 Canadian Development Report. It's great to see such a great turnout. I'm going to be presenting the chapter that was written by myself and Haney Basada, who's also a senior researcher at the North-South Institute. And our chapter was entitled Multilateral Development Cooperation, Current Trends and Future Prospects. In the chapter, we broadly look at three issues, namely support for the multilateral system, proliferation of multilaterals, and how to include new development actors in the aid, effectiveness, or increasingly development cooperation-oriented discussions. Now, it's important to keep in mind that the chapter was written before the fourth high-level forum on aid effectiveness last year, and as a result, I will make reference to Busan throughout my presentation where it's relevant for the topic. So I thought I'd start off with discussing some of the advantages and challenges facing multilateral development cooperation. So in terms of advantages, we know that the multilaterals play an important role in addressing global challenges. Here we might think of climate change, the financial crisis, these sort of problems without passports. In terms of their development cooperation, they achieve economies of scale owing to their size and scope. They have an incredible amount of expertise and historical relationships with most developing countries that allows them access. They tend to fare quite well on evaluations vis-a-vis their bilateral counterparts, and this is shown very clearly in the chapter by Robert Picciotto in the CDR. However, they do face challenges, and one of those challenges is declining support. Core contributions to multilateral organizations have fallen from 33% of total official development assistance in 2001 to 28% in 2009, according to the OECD 2011 review of multilateral aid. Now, there's also been a rise in earmarked funding. Now, core funding for the multilaterals is funding for their core operations, whereas earmarked refers to projects or programs that it's funding that goes through the multilateral. And in this case, the multilateral serves more as an implementing agency. And some are calling this the bilateralization of multilateral aid. Now, according to the OECD, there are several reasons for this. One is that there's a higher percentage of aid going to the multilaterals for fragile states. In 2009, the multilaterals, 70% of aid allocated to the multilaterals was for fragile states. But there's other reasons as well. Bilateral donors are seeking to focus, and by providing aid through the multilaterals, it affords them the opportunity to continue having a presence in regions where they're no longer operating bilaterally. Some also see this as flag planting, and others suggest that it's easier for bilateral donors to demonstrate results through earmarked funding. But this does create a problem in terms of fragmentation. It can mean the duplication of efforts. It encourages multilaterals to carry out projects that may not fit perfectly with their expertise or their mandate. Another issue facing the multilaterals is proliferation. So in 1940, there were 15 multilateral organizations, where there is now over 260. And this is problematic when you consider where the bulk of funding is going. It's actually going to 5 groupings. So in 2009, roughly 80% of core funding to the multilaterals went to the UN funds and programs, the World Bank's International Development Association, the European Union's Development Fund and budget, the Asian and African Development Banks, and finally the Global Fund. This means some 200 organizations share the remaining 20% of core funding. Now, these issues have not been lost on the international community. In 2008, at the third high-level forum on aid effectiveness, participants adopted the Think Twice rule, where they agreed to think twice before setting up new channels. So given these challenges, the issue of proliferation, declining support, and also we all know the increasing focus on value for money and results that donors are having, what's needed? Well, in the chapter, we make the case that what's needed is actually a rationalization of the multilateral system and an assessment and evaluation of the system as a whole, rather than looking at the individual organizations. And of course, there's no shortage of assessments of multilateral organizations and evaluations. In fact, some suggest there's a proliferation of even those, and that unto itself is inefficient. But what we're talking about is a much more systemic approach. And here, the international community would agree on a framework that would serve 3 functions. The first would be to identify overlap between these organizations and to begin a process of examining division of labor and where potential mergers could occur. Secondly, it would demonstrate how and to what extent multilateral development institutions contribute to results. And third, set a minimum benchmark for performance, providing a mechanism to phase out underperforming organizations that are either unable or unwilling to change. Now, of course, this kind of process would be highly political. We know there would be winners and losers, as we saw in the UK's recent multilateral review, for example. But nevertheless, it would move us in the right direction towards rationalizing the system. And of course, developing country perspectives would be key. Not only key just to the legitimacy, but also in thinking about ownership and effectiveness. There's been research that's been done by the Overseas Development Institute in the UK looking at the types of partners that developing countries prefer to partner with. And it found that developing countries may be more willing to partner with a multilateral that is seen as less effective if it's seen as supporting ownership. And so this creates a bit of a tension or a challenge in thinking about, well, how do donors support the multilaterals that are the preferred partners of developing countries, and where they're not effective, how do we make them effective? And so I think it raises those kinds of issues. At the fourth high-level forum on aid effectiveness, there were two types of outcomes. There was the Busan actual partnership agreement, the actual outcome document, but there were also voluntary initiatives and building blocks, which are essentially coalitions of the willing to carry forward work on particular areas where supporters would like to see more progress. So in terms of the outcome document, under transparent and responsible cooperation, those who endorsed the Busan outcome document agreed to improve the coherence of their policies in multilaterals and to use existing channels. They also agreed to work to reduce proliferation of multilaterals and to agree on guidelines for those efforts by the end of 2012. There was a building block on managing diversity and reducing fragmentation, which dealt with a whole host of issues with respect to fragmentation, but in relation to what I'm talking about, they did reaffirm the think twice principle from Accra. Oh, I've forgotten that I have a PowerPoint. My apologies. So another issue facing the multilateral system, of course, is the changing development cooperation landscape. And we've heard a bit about that from Margaret as well as from Jacqueline. I'm not going to talk so much about the issues, rather, I'll talk a bit more about some of the new actors. So we all know that the private sector is playing an increasing role in development cooperation. So here we can think of the private foundations, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which we seem to hear so much about, for example. And these organizations are contributing money to multilateral initiatives. There was also language of aid as a catalyst in the lead up to the high-level forum, and Margaret made reference to bringing in the private sector. And I would suggest that this aid as a catalyst language was really about recognizing that aid is really only one tool in the toolbox, and how do we harness other development resources. And so we did see in the lead up to the high-level forum an attempt to bring the private sector into discussions, and we also saw a statement in Busan on the private sector that was supported by a number of donors. The other group that I'm going to speak about is the emerging donors. Now, again, we've heard about them. They're playing an increasing role. How much of a lead will they take up in multilateral institutions? Well, in relation to how much of a role they're already playing with the multilaterals, the evidence is sort of mixed in terms of their contribution. So you have the Arab donors, for example, that contribute very little to the multilateral system, whereas donors such as Brazil and Russia deliver quite a bit more. But I think their importance is also significant in terms of the ideas that they're injecting into the system. So here we can think about discussions on South-South cooperation or alternative models of development, and talk of a Beijing consensus, for example. And I think the increasing recognition of the role of these various actors played largely into this language around enlarging the tent in the lead up to the high-level forum. Now, I think the whole issue around the aid architecture and around inclusivity was partly about recognizing that the development system is changing, that there are these new actors on board, but it was also about legitimacy, and legitimacy for an agenda that had historically been dominated by OECD donors. And I think that part of enlarging the tent meant that bringing these donors in would increase the legitimacy of this process. So in the chapter, we actually reviewed various options for the post-Busan governance framework. And we came to the conclusion that there actually needed to be a lot more analysis and a lot more of an understanding of different stakeholder perceptions. And to a certain extent, there was a perception of a trade-off between legitimacy and effectiveness. So on the one hand, you may have some groups that came out or are willing to support a UN-driven process, for example, such as civil society, or perhaps some of the emerging donors. But it's not clear that traditional donors, on the other hand, would be willing to launch discussions in the UN given their perceptions of effectiveness. On the other hand, if governance of the aid architecture did not move sufficiently away from the OECD, there's a risk to obtaining real and significant buy-in from the new actors that are skeptical of the aid effectiveness agenda in terms of, one, the lack of results, and two, whether or not there's actually enough incentives for them to engage, given that these actors are not necessarily, aid is only a small portion of what they're actually doing when they talk about development cooperation. So emerging donors were at the table in Busan and in the lead up to the high-level forum, and there was a lot of pressure, certainly to get, and as Margaret said, it was the sort of the benchmark for success to get these actors in. And I mean, in the end, the emerging donors did endorse the outcome document, but it wasn't without an important caveat. And some of my colleagues and I call this sort of voluntary, recognizing that these declarations, of course, are voluntary for all that endorse, but in the case of the providers of South-South cooperation, the word voluntary actually appears in the text in relation to their commitments. I would say that we're still facing some uncertainty now, as participants in Busan look to establish the working arrangements for the global partnership, including its governance and indicators and monitoring frameworks. They've set a due date for themselves of June 2012 to have these in place. And I still think it's a bit unclear the extent to which these emerging donors and new actors will actually engage. And I really think that only time will tell. Thank you.